U.S. warplanes hitting targets in Libya for a second day today, and I have to say this at the outset. The media get excited by war. The journalistic adrenaline starts pumping as we talk about warships and warplanes and cruise missiles, and we put up the maps and we have the retired generals on. And sometimes something is lost in that initial excitement. It reminds me of 8 years ago, this very weekend, when shock and awe was rained down upon Baghdad and the media utterly failed to ask skeptical questions. So I looked at my New York Times this morning, went through all the sections. I looked at my Washington Post this morning. I looked through all the sections. Didn't see any skeptical articles, columns, editorials about this no-fly zone decision. Two fine newspapers, don't see the skeptical questions. What if there's a long-term stalemate here? What if this goes on and on? What if there are American casualties? Do you stop this operation with Gaddafi still in power? These are the questions I think we need to be asking. And to help us answer them this morning here in Washington, Rome Hartman, executive producer of BBC World News America and a former executive producer of the CBS Evening News. Fred Francis, former Pentagon correspondent for NBC News, now consults with clients dealing with the media in times of crisis. And Jamie McIntyre, founder of the Line of Departure blog and a former Pentagon correspondent for CNN. We'll start with you, Rome. Where are the skeptical questions?
Well, I think that it's natural, as you suggested, that at the very outset of something, the operational questions do take precedence. I think that it's not our job to make policy or, frankly, to comment on policy.
But it is our job to question policy.
No question about that.
And this was everybody in the media said this wouldn't happen again. We screwed up on Iraq. We got sucked up in a rush to war. And I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad decision. Gaddafi is an odious fellow. Yeah. But I think we need to be doing more challenging.
Well, the key issue, I think, is I think the media is exhausted. Frankly, in the last 3, 4, 5 weeks, with what happened starting in Cairo, over to Japan, now back to Libya, I think there's an exhaustion going on, and not enough questions have been asked.
But not too exhausted to be on the air 24 hours a day.
But shallow coverage. In fact, shallow coverage. You know, we didn't pay enough attention to John Brennan, the president's counterterrorism chief, this week when he said, and he was reluctant to advise the president to go to war here. Brennan said this week, we don't know who these rebels are. We don't know what we're getting.
This is not heavy lifting. I mean, you know, Howie, I think you're exactly right. I mean, there's this tendency in the initial stages to debate whether it's 110 or 112 cruise missiles. But the real questions that were sort of absent from a lot of the coverage was, what is this no-fly zone expected to accomplish? Is it too little, too late? How do you have a no-fly zone when you really have to protect rebels on the ground? You know, you heard the Pentagon has been very reluctant about this all along, from the Secretary Gates to Admiral Mullen, and you've heard them talk about how limited this action is. The military is loath to commit to a goal that can't be accomplished through military means, and clearly they believe that there's a goal here that can't be accomplished through military means.
And the question that hangs over all of this is the United States, with very little debate except about the tactics of this no-fly zone, being sucked into a third war?
But there's another dimension to it, too. It's not just whether it will work in Libya or whether it's the right thing to do in Libya. But you look at Yemen and you look at Bahrain, and it's a very natural and sensible and necessary question to say, okay, so why there and not there? What are the dimensions that make this different from that? So there's operational questions that have to be asked, but there are also questions of parity and why intervention in one place where civilians are being killed is okay, and not in another where civilians are being killed. As recently as Friday in Yemen, I mean, there was a massacre in Yemen.
I think it's interesting that in this administration, and this was some remarkable reporting, I think, by the New York Times this week, that it was three women who pressed the president to go ahead. Hillary Clinton, who was reluctant at start, Hillary Clinton, Samantha Powers from the National Security Council, and Ann Rice, the United Nations ambassador, going against the advice of the Secretary of Defense Gates, Brennan, the counterterrorism chief, and Donald, the national security. So 3 women pressed the president to change his mind. But why did they do that? And I say they did it because Hillary Clinton went to France and realized that the French were going to take the lead, and the United States was just going to take the lead politically and policy-wise.
Since you raised that, it's interesting the way these stories get written about reconstructing an important decision. And a lot of news organizations tackle this, but the New York Times from yesterday, I have the headline here, "Shift by Clinton helped persuade President to take a harder line. Within hours, Mrs. Clinton and the aides had convinced Mr. Obama that the United States had to act." When one person, in this case the Secretary of State, gets so much more credit in one news account, I wonder whether or not a certain amount of leaking and spinning was going on.
Well, you know, one really interesting thing about journalism is very hard to know what's going on at the time it's going on. I was just talking to Doug Feith the other day from the administration, and we were talking about all these memoirs that are written after the, from the Bush administration, I'm sorry. We were talking about all these memoirs that are written after the fact, Donald Rumsfeld's, Feith's own memoir, everybody's memoir. And one of the interesting things he said was he was reading a lot of these memoirs, says he didn't know what some of the people who were actually involved in the decision-making were thinking at the time until he read some of their books. So when you go back in real time, try to reconstruct exactly the dynamics of behind-the-scenes decision-making, it's very difficult to do.
I think another point we have to make here is this week was the impression that the Obama administration was not really paying attention. I think it was counterproductive for the Obama administration to show the president, and even though it was a short period of time, picking out his NCAA basketball brackets. At the same time, we had a meltdown going on in Japan.
Well, I would disagree with that because the notion that the president can play golf, can indulge in a little basketball fun, I think is something where the media is jumping
symbolism.
on.
It was the symbolism
but this is a very different situation. Normally, when we have military action on the scale that we've seen in the last 24 hours, the president is in the Oval Office. He comes out. He gives the case for why he's putting U.S. troops in danger. And here we saw there's a very calculated effort to portray the United States as taking a back seat, even to the point where the president didn't announce the action.
Let me come back to the larger question here, which is the way the media are covering what is being sold by the administration as a somewhat limited action, a no-fly zone to prevent a massacre by Gaddafi of the rebels in the eastern part of the country, but really looks like the start, or could look like, in retrospect, the start of a war. We are having to cover this from a distance. I'm reminded of Iraq because the first pictures are provided by the Pentagon, by the Navy. You can't. We've got video here. We're taking a look at still shots of those Tomahawk missiles being fired from warships off the coast of Libya. This is journalism that, by necessity, we can't get to the front lines when it's an air war.
On the other hand, though, we have, we, just speaking for the BBC, have correspondents in Tripoli and in Benghazi reporting sort of two fronts there. And, Alan Little, our correspondent, has been live from Tripoli reporting on what he hears and obviously it's very difficult to cover this kind of a story. You're going to have competing versions of what has happened. You already have
Gaddafi already saying civilians have been killed. Maybe that is true. Maybe that is not true. And we have no way to verify it.
There's a way, the hospital pictures are already being trotted out of supposedly innocent victims. This is a very tough, cynical circumstance in which to try to cover this story.
And what about the risk to journalists? You have some experience with cruise missiles. You haven't fired any, but you were there in Bosnia.
The very first cruise missile fired from the USS Normandy in the Bosnia War, I was on that ship that fired the cruise missile. Frankly, I had no idea where that cruise missile was going. They fired 16 of them that day. The most experience I had, and show how difficult this is, was exactly 8 years ago this week. I was inside Iraq waiting for our country to invade us. It was a good thing that it was, as a journalist, a great story to be inside Iraq, but we were also scared because we didn't want to get hit by our own forces. It's a very dangerous situation today. Since last Tuesday, we have not seen or heard from Anthony Shadid and three others.
And I'm going to come back to that in the next segment. But let me turn to Jamie McIntyre. Okay. You have been in this situation over many years of being up live on CNN hour after hour when a war is going on. Is there, nobody wants to root against United States forces. Is there a certain rah-rah element that takes over that somehow overshadows or submerges the kind of skeptical questions I was talking about at the top?
Well, I'm going to admit right up front that when I was covering the Pentagon for CNN, I was generally rooting for the United States. Okay, let's just get that out of the way. But that doesn't mean you're not skeptical about, how the policy is being conducted. For instance, in this operation, the key questions are, at the Pentagon, they refer to this as mission creep. It clearly can't prevent Gaddafi's forces from prevailing on the ground with just a no-fly zone. There's going to have to be some sort of action on the ground as well, and whether that will be left to other allies or what that will be. And, what you have to keep coming back to as a reporter is what are the foreign policy objectives? What are the forces that are being employed to achieve those? Is it possible? Are they the right objectives? And those are the kind of questions you're going to be asking. And the mechanics of exactly how many cruise missiles went are somewhat irrelevant.
I've been struck by the difference in the tone between 2003 and 91 at the first Gulf War.
Right.
There were weeks of buildup and anticipation. I remember inside newsrooms, just as well as inside the Oval Office of the Pentagon, incredible buildup toward the opening of those assaults.
Everybody's gearing up to cover war.
When it happened last night, it was kind of like, yeah, here we go. It was much more sort of matter of fact.
Well, we have been through a lot of wars.
I know. I think it's a measure of that.
Here we go, indeed.
This is the exhaustion I was talking about. Right.